The silence in the studio was deafening. J.D. Vance's words hung in the air like a thunderclap, reverberating through the room and leaving everyone stunned. Mark Reynolds, the journalist who had been so confident just moments ago, now sat frozen, his mouth slightly agape as if he'd been struck by an invisible force. The audience, a mix of political enthusiasts and curious onlookers, exchanged wide-eyed glances, unsure of how to react. Even the crew, usually immune to the drama of live television, paused in their duties, captivated by the raw emotion that had just unfolded. J.D. didn't wait for a response. He leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but resolute, as if he'd just laid down a truth too heavy for anyone to refute. The host, sensing the tension, quickly interjected with a nervous laugh, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "Well, that's certainly a powerful perspective, Mr. Vance. Let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back after these messages." The red light on the camera blinked off, and the room erupted into a low buzz of murmurs. Producers rushed onto the set, whispering urgently to the host and Mark Reynolds. J.D., however, remained seated, his gaze distant, as if he were replaying the moment in his mind. He hadn't planned to say what he'd said. It had just come out, unfiltered and unscripted. But now that it was out there, he felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. As the crew prepared for the next segment, a young production assistant approached J.D., her eyes wide with admiration. "Mr. Vance, that was incredible," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never seen anything like that." J.D. offered her a small, tired smile. "Sometimes the truth just needs to be said," he replied simply. But as he stood to leave the set, something unexpected happened. A man in a dark suit, someone J.D. hadn't noticed before, stepped into his path. The man's face was unreadable, his eyes hidden behind tinted glasses. Without a word, he slipped an envelope into J.D.'s hand and disappeared into the crowd as quickly as he had appeared. J.D. frowned, turning the envelope over in his hands. It was plain, unmarked, and sealed tightly. His name was written on the front in neat, blocky letters. For a moment, he considered tossing it aside. He'd had enough drama for one day. But something about the man's demeanor, the urgency in his silent gesture, made J.D. hesitate. He stepped into a quiet corner of the studio and tore open the envelope. Inside was a single photograph and a note. The photograph showed a young boy, no older than 10, standing in front of a crumbling house. The boy's face was hauntingly familiar. It was J.D. himself. The note read, "You think you know your past. You don't. Dig deeper, or the truth will bury you." J.'s heart raced as he stared at the photo. His mind flashed back to his childhood, to the small, run-down house in Middletown, Ohio, where he'd grown up. He remembered the struggles, the fights, the nights he'd gone to bed hungry. But this photo, it didn't fit. The house in the picture wasn't the one he remembered. And the boy, though it was clearly him, looked different, lost, afraid. Before he could process what he was seeing, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. "Be careful, J.D., some truths are better left buried." J.D. felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced around the studio, suddenly hyper-aware of the people around him. Were they watching him? Was this some kind of setup? Or was he just being paranoid? He didn't have time to think. The host was calling him back to the set, and the cameras were about to roll again. Jade shoved the photo and note into his pocket, his mind racing. He'd have to deal with this later. But as he sat back down in the hot seat, his thoughts were far from the interview. The photograph, the note, the text, they all pointed to something bigger, something darker. And J.D. knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. J.D. Vance stepped out of the studio into the cool night air, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. The city lights buzzed around him, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the cryptic note and the haunting photograph over and over. You think you know your past. You don't. Dig deeper, or the truth will bury you. He hailed a cab and slid into the back seat, his thoughts racing. The driver asked for a destination, but JD hesitated. Where could he go? Home felt too exposed, too ordinary for whatever was unfolding. Instead, he gave the address of a quiet coffee shop he frequented, a place where he could think without interruption. As the cab pulled away from the curb, JD pulled out the photograph again. The boy in the picture was unmistakably him, but the setting was all wrong. The house in the background wasn't the one he'd grown up in. It was older, more dilapidated, with a sagging roof and broken windows. He didn't recognize it, but something about it felt familiar. The note's words echoed in his mind. Dig deeper. But how? Where? His childhood was a blur of hardship and survival, memories he'd buried long ago. His adoptive mother, Bev, had raised him with love, but she'd never spoken much about his early years. Whenever he'd asked about his father or where he'd come from, she'd changed the subject, her eyes clouded with something he couldn't quite place, fear, maybe, or guilt. The cab pulled up to the coffee shop, and JD paid the driver, stepping out into the dimly lit street. Inside, the shop was nearly empty, save for a few students hunched over laptops and an elderly couple sipping tea in the corner. JD ordered a black coffee and took a seat by the window, the envelope resting on the table in front of him. He pulled out his phone and stared at the second message he'd received. Your real mother. Find her before they do. The grainy photo of the woman and the baby was still on the screen. He zoomed in, trying to make out the woman's face, but it was too blurred. The baby, though, it had to be him. But who was the woman? And who were they? Jay took a deep breath and opened his laptop. He started with a simple search. Missing child, Middletown, Ohio, 1990s. The results were overwhelming. Pages of cold cases and unsolved mysteries. He narrowed it down, adding keywords like adoption and abandoned child, but nothing matched. Frustrated, he leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Maybe he was going about this the wrong way. If this was about his past, he needed to start with what he knew. He opened a new tab and typed Bev Vance, Middletown, Ohio. The first result was an obituary. Bev had passed away 5 years ago, and JD felt a pang of grief as he read the familiar words. She'd been his rock, the one constant in a life filled with chaos. But now, he couldn't shake the feeling that she'd been hiding something from him. He scrolled further, finding an old article from a local newspaper. It was a human interest piece about Bev, written shortly after JD had gained national attention for his memoir. The article described her as a devoted single mother who had sacrificed everything to raise her son. But one line caught his eye. Bev Vance moved to Middletown in 1985 with her infant son, seeking a fresh start after a difficult divorce. JD frowned. He'd always been told that his father had died when he was a baby. But if Bev had moved to Middletown after a divorce, that meant his father had been alive at some point. So why had she lied? He closed the laptop and stayed out the window, his mind spinning. The coffee in front of him had gone cold, but he barely noticed. He needed answers, and there was only one place he could think to start: Middletown. The return to Middletown. The next morning, JD boarded a flight to Ohio. He told his team he was taking a few days off to clear his head. But the truth was, he couldn't shake the feeling that his entire life was built on a lie. Middletown hadn't changed much since he'd left. The streets were still lined with boarded-up shops and crumbling buildings, a stark reminder of the town's decline. JD drove through the familiar streets, his chest tightening as memories flooded back. He pulled up to the house where he'd grown up, a small, weathered bungalow with a sagging porch. The current owners had let the yard go to seed, and the once white paint was now a dull gray. JD sat in his car for a long moment, staring at the house. This was where it had all started, or so he'd thought. He got out of the car and walked up to the door, his heart pounding. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he had to start somewhere. The door opened before he could knock, and a middle-aged woman with tired eyes peered out. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice wary. JD forced a smile. "Hi, I'm JD Vance. I used to live here. I was wondering if I could take a look around. It's for a project I'm working on." The woman hesitated, then shrugged. "Sure, why not? Just don't take too long." JD stepped inside, the familiar smells and sounds hitting him like a wave. The house was smaller than he remembered, the walls closing in around him. He walked through the living room, his fingers brushing against the faded wallpaper. But it was the basement that drew him. He'd always hated it as a kid. It was dark, damp, and filled with shadows. But now, it felt like the key to everything. He descended the creaky stairs, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement was cluttered with boxes and old furniture, but one corner caught his eye. There, hidden behind a stack of boxes, was a small door. Jay's breath caught in his throat. He'd never noticed it before. He pushed the boxes aside and knelt in front of the door, his hands trembling as he turned the rusted handle. It opened with a groan, revealing a hidden room. Inside was a single box, covered in dust. JD pulled it out and opened it, his heart racing. Inside were more photographs, old letters, and a journal. The journal was his mother's, the handwriting unmistakable. He flipped it open to the first page, and his eyes widened as he read the words. "I didn't want to lie to him, but I had no choice. If they ever find out who he really is, they'll kill him." JD Vance sat in his rental car, the box of photographs and his mother's journal resting on the passenger seat. His hands still trembled as he flipped through the pages of the journal, each entry revealing fragments of a story he never knew existed. Bev's words were raw and unfiltered, a desperate attempt to document the truth she'd been forced to hide. "I didn't want to lie to him, but I had no choice. If they ever find out who he really is, they'll kill him." The words echoed in his mind, sending a chill down his spine. Who was he really? And who were they? JD closed the journal and started the car. He needed answers, and there was only one person he could think of who might have them. Mrs. Margaret Maggie Thompson, his mother's oldest friend. Maggie had been a constant presence in his childhood, a warm, grandmotherly figure who always seemed to know more than she let on. If anyone could shed light on Bev's secrets, it was her. The visit to Maggie. Maggie lived in a small house on the outskirts of Middletown, a place JD had visited countless times as a child. The sight of her porch swing and the flower boxes filled with geraniums brought a wave of nostalgia, but it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of his mission. He knocked on the door, and after a moment, Maggie appeared. Her face lit up with surprise and delight. "JD, oh my goodness, what a wonderful surprise," she exclaimed, pulling him into a tight hug. "Hi Maggie," G said, forcing a smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Nonsense. Come in," she said, ushering him inside. The house was exactly as he remembered it, cozy and cluttered, with photographs covering every surface. Maggie led him to the kitchen, where she poured him a cup of tea and set out a plate of cookies. "Now, what brings you back to Middletown?" she asked, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. JD hesitated, unsure of how to begin. "Maggie, I need to ask you something about my mom. Something important." Maggie's smile faded, and she sat down across from him, her expression serious. "What is it, dear?" JD pulled out the photograph from the envelope, the one of the young boy standing in front of the crumbling house. He slid it across the table to Maggie. "Do you recognize this?" Maggie picked up the photograph, her hands trembling slightly. She studied it for a long moment, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh, JD," she whispered. "Where did you get this?" "Someone sent it to me," Jade said. "They said I don't know my past, that I need to dig deeper." "Maggie, what's going on? Who is that boy?" Maggie sighed deeply, setting the photograph down. That's you, JD, but it's not the whole story. JD's heart raced. What do you mean? Maggie looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. Your mother. She wasn't your birth mother, JD. She took you in to protect you. JD felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. Protect me from what? Maggie hesitated, then stood and walked over to a cabinet. She pulled out an old, dusty photo album and brought it back to the table. She opened it to a page near the middle and pointed to a photograph of a young woman holding a baby. This is your real mother, Maggie said. Her name was Sarah. She was a kind, gentle soul, but she got mixed up with the wrong people. When you were just a baby, she came to Bev, begging for help. She said her life was in danger, and yours was too. Bev didn't hesitate. She took you in and raised you as her own. JD stared at the photograph, his mind reeling. The woman in the picture was the same one from the grainy photo he'd received on his phone. What happened to her? He asked, his voice barely audible. Maggie's eyes filled with tears. She disappeared. JD, no one ever saw her again. Bev tried to find her, but it was like she'd vanished into thin air. JD felt a lump form in his throat. And my father. Who was he? Maggie shook her head. I don't know, dear. Sarah never talked about him. But whoever he was dangerous. That's why Bev kept your past a secret. She was afraid they'd come for you if they ever found out who you really were. JD sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. All these years, he'd thought he knew who he was. But now, he realized he'd been living a lie. The search for Sarah. JD spent the next few days digging through public records, searching for any trace of Sarah. He started with birth certificates, hoping to find her full name, but came up empty-handed. Then he turned to old newspaper archives, looking for any mention of a missing woman from the 1980s. Finally, he found something, a small article from 1985 about a woman named Sarah Collins who had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. The article mentioned that she had a baby, but there were no details about the child. Jay's heart raced as he read the article. Could this be her? He needed to know more. He tracked down the reporter who had written the article, a man named Frank Miller, who had retired years ago but still lived in the area. Frank agreed to meet with JD at a diner in town. The meeting with Frank. Frank was an elderly man with a sharp mind and a no-nonsense attitude. He listened intently as JD explained his situation, then nodded slowly. Sarah Collins, Frank said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. I remember her. She was a sweet girl, but she was mixed up with some bad people. I'd always thought there was more to her disappearance than met the eye. What do you mean? JD asked. Frank leaned in, lowering his voice. There were rumors, JD rumors, that she'd gotten involved with a powerful man. Someone who didn't want their relationship made public. When she disappeared, some people thought it was no accident. JD's stomach churned. Do you know who this man was? Frank hesitated, then shook his head. No one knew for sure. But if I were you, I'd start looking into the people who had power in this town back then. Politicians, businessmen, anyone who had something to lose. The black SUV idled beside JD, its engine purring like a predator ready to strike. The man in the dark suit stared at him, his expression unreadable behind tinted sunglasses. JD's heart raced, his mind flashing back to the envelope, the photograph, and the cryptic warnings. Who are you? JD demanded, taking a step back. The man didn't answer. Instead, he opened the passenger door and gestured for JD to get in. We don't have much time, he said, his voice low and urgent. JD hesitated. Every instinct told him to run, but curiosity and the desperate need for answers held him in place. If you have something to say it here, he said, his voice firm. The man sighed, as if JD were a child testing his patience. Listen, Mr. Vance. You're digging into things you don't understand. If you want to live long enough to find the truth, you'll get in the car. JD glanced around the parking lot. It was empty, save for a few scattered cars. He was alone, and the man in the SUV clearly wasn't going to take no for an answer. Against his better judgment, JD slid into the passenger seat. The door closed with a soft click, and the SUV pulled away from the curb, merging into traffic. The conversation in the SUV. The man drove in silence for several minutes, his eyes fixed on the road. JD studied him, trying to gauge his intentions. He was in his late 40s, with a sharp jawline and a military-style haircut. His hands gripped the steering wheel with precision, and his posture was rigid, almost robotic. "Who are you?" JD asked again, breaking the silence. "Call me Agent Cole," the man said. "I'm with a specialized branch of the government. Let's just say we have an interest in your situation." "My situation?" JD repeated, his voice rising. "You mean the fact that my entire life is a lie? That my mother wasn't really my mother, and my real mother might have been murdered?" "Yeah, I'd say that's a situation." Agent Cole's expression didn't change. "We've been monitoring you for some time, Mr. Vance. Ever since you started gaining public attention, we knew this day would come." JD felt a surge of anger. "You knew? And you didn't think to tell me?" "It wasn't our place," Cole said simply. "But now that you're digging into things, we need to make sure you don't stumble into the wrong places." "What does that mean?" JD asked, his voice tight. Cole glanced at him, his eyes hidden behind the sunglasses. "It means there are people out there who don't want the truth to come out. People who will do whatever it takes to keep it buried. If you keep pushing, you're going to get yourself killed." JD leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. "So what are you saying? I should just drop it. Forget about my real mother, my past, everything." Cole's jaw tightened. "I'm saying you need to be careful. And if you're going to keep digging, you need to know what you're up against." The SUV pulled into an abandoned industrial park, the buildings looming like skeletons against the gray sky. Cole parked the car and turned to face JD. "Your mother, your real mother, was involved in something much bigger than you realize," he said. "Something that goes beyond Middletown, beyond Ohio. If you want to find the truth, you're going to have to go deeper than you ever imagined." The hidden room. Cole handed JD a small, folded map. "This will lead you to a safe house. There's something there you need to see." JD unfolded the map, his eyes scanning the handwritten directions. "What's at the safe house?" "Answers," Cole said. "But be careful. You're not the only one looking for them." JD stepped out of the SUV, the map clutched in his hand. The wind whipped around him as he watched the vehicle drive away, leaving him alone in the desolate industrial park. The safe house was a small, nondescript building at the edge of the park. JD approached cautiously, his senses on high alert. The door was unlocked, and he stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was sparse, with a single table and a few chairs. But in the corner, hidden behind a false wall, was a hidden room. JD pushed the wall aside and stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat. The room was filled with documents, photographs, and maps, all related to his mother, Sarah Collins. There were newspaper clippings, police reports, and even surveillance photos. But what caught his eye was a large map pinned to the wall, with red lines connecting various locations across the country. At the center of the map was a name, the Orion Group. The revelation. JD spent hours poring over the documents, piecing together the fragments of his mother's life. Sarah Collins had been more than just a woman caught in a dangerous relationship. She had been a whistleblower, someone who had uncovered a conspiracy involving powerful people. The Orion Group, according to the documents, was a shadowy organization with ties to government officials, corporate executives, and criminal networks. They were involved in everything from illegal arms deals to human trafficking, and they operated with impunity, protected by their wealth and influence. Sarah had stumbled onto their secrets, and she had paid the price. But before she disappeared, she had hidden evidence. Evidence that could bring down the entire organization. JD felt a surge of determination. His mother had died trying to expose the truth, and now it was up to him to finish what she had started. Vance moved through the darkness like a shadow, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The documents he'd taken from the safe house were clutched tightly to his chest, their weight a constant reminder of the danger he was in. Behind him, the sound of voices and footsteps grew louder, echoing through the empty industrial park. He ducked behind a rusted storage container, pressing his back against the cold metal as he tried to steady his breathing. His mind raced, replaying the moments leading up to this. The hidden room, the map, the name Orion Group scrawled in bold letters. Whoever was after him, they weren't just random thugs. They were organized, methodical, and clearly willing to do whatever it took to keep their secrets buried. A beam of light swept across the ground a few feet away, and JD held his breath, his heart pounding in his ears. The voices were closer now, low and urgent. "Spread out," one of them said. "He can't have gone far." JD peered around the edge of the container, his eyes scanning the area. There were at least 3 men, all dressed in black and armed with flashlights and handguns. They moved with precision, their movements coordinated and deliberate. He needed a plan, and fast. The escape. JD crouched low, his mind racing. The industrial park was a maze of abandoned buildings and storage units. But he knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. He needed to get out of there, and he needed to do it without being seen. He glanced down at the documents in his hands. They were his only link to the truth, the only thing that could expose the Orion Group and clear his mother's name. He couldn't let them fall into the wrong hands. Taking a deep breath, JD made his move. He darted out from behind the container and sprinted toward the nearest building, his footsteps silent against the gravel. The men shouted, their flashlights sweeping in his direction, but he was already slipping through a broken window and into the darkness beyond. Inside, the building was a labyrinth of empty rooms and crumbling walls. JD moved quickly, his instincts guiding him through the maze. He could hear the men behind him, their voices growing louder as they closed in. He reached a door at the far end of the building and pushed it open, stepping out into the night. The industrial park stretched out before him, a sea of shadows and silence. He needed to get to his car, but it was parked on the other side of the complex, too far to reach without being seen. Then he remembered the map Agent Cole had given him. He pulled it out of his pocket, his hands trembling as he unfolded it. There, marked in red, was a secondary exit, a tunnel that led under the complex and out to the main road. JD didn't hesitate. He followed the map to a hidden hatch near the edge of the property, his heart pounding as he lifted the heavy metal lid and climbed down into the darkness. The tunnel. The tunnel was narrow and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. JD moved quickly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he followed the map's directions. The sound of his footsteps echoed off the walls, a constant reminder of how exposed he was. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. After what felt like an eternity, he reached the end of the tunnel and climbed out into the cool night air. The main road was just ahead, and his car was parked a short distance away. He sprinted to it, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. As he pulled out onto the road, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The industrial park was a dark silhouette against the sky, but there was no sign of the men who had been chasing him. For now, he was safe. The documents. JD drove for hours, putting as much distance between himself and the industrial park as possible. When he finally felt safe enough to stop, he pulled into a secluded rest area and parked under the cover of some trees. He turned on the interior light and spread the documents out on the passenger seat, his hands trembling as he began to read. The Orion Group was more than just a shadowy organization. It was a network of powerful individuals who operated above the law. They were involved in everything from illegal arms deals to human trafficking, and they had ties to government officials, corporate executives, and criminal networks. But what caught JD's attention was a name that kept appearing in the documents: Senator Richard Grayson. Grayson was a prominent political figure, a man who had built his career on a platform of integrity and justice. But according to the documents, he was also one of the Orion Group's most influential members. JD felt a surge of anger as he read through the files. Grayson had been involved in some of the group's most heinous crimes, including the cover-up of Sarah Collins' disappearance. He had used his power and influence to silence anyone who got too close to the truth, and he had done it all while maintaining his public image as a champion of the people. But there was more. The documents also contained evidence of a secret meeting between Grayson and Sarah, just days before she disappeared. According to the notes, Sarah had threatened to expose the Orion Group, and Grayson had promised to protect her if she handed over the evidence she had collected. But she had never gotten the chance. The threat. JD's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was another text from the unknown number. "They know you have the documents. Be careful." Before he could respond, his phone rang. The number was blocked, but he answered anyway. "J.D. Vance," a voice said, cold and menacing. "You've made a big mistake." J.D. froze, his heart pounding. "Who is this?" "You don't need to know who I am," the voice replied. "What you need to know is this: if you don't hand over the documents, you're a dead man." J.D. clenched his fists, his anger boiling over. "You can't intimidate me. I know what you've done, and I'm going to expose you." The voice laughed, a low, chilling sound. "You're in over your head, Vance. You have no idea what you're up against." The line went dead, and JD stared at his phone, his mind racing. He was in deeper than he'd ever imagined, and the stakes were higher than ever. G. Vance drove through the night, the documents spread across the passenger seat like pieces of a puzzle he was desperate to solve. The threat from the unknown caller lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of the danger he was in. But he couldn't stop now. He was too close. The name Senator Richard Grayson burned in his thoughts. How could a man who presented himself as a paragon of justice be involved in something so dark? JD needed answers, and he knew there was only one place to find them: Washington, D.C. The journey to D.C. JD made the drive in record time, his mind racing with every mile. He avoided major highways, sticking to back roads and small towns to stay off the radar. The documents were his lifeline, and he couldn't risk losing them. When he finally reached D.C., the city was alive with the buzz of politics and power. Towering government buildings loomed over the streets, their grandeur a stark contrast to the corruption JD was uncovering. He checked into a small, nondescript motel on the outskirts of the city, paying in cash to avoid leaving a paper trail. The room was cramped and smelled faintly of mildew, but it was safe, for now. The investigation begins. JD spread the documents out on the motel room's small table, his eyes scanning the pages for anything he might have missed. The connection between Senator Grayson and the Orion Group was clear, but he needed more, something concrete that he could use to expose the truth. One document caught his eye, a list of names and dates, all linked to offshore accounts. Grayson's name appeared multiple times, alongside amounts that made JD's head spin. Millions of dollars, funneled through shell companies and hidden behind layers of bureaucracy. But it was the last name on the list that stopped him cold: Evelyn Grayson. JD frowned. Evelyn Grayson was the senator's wife, a philanthropist known for her work with children's charities. What was her name doing on a list of offshore accounts? He grabbed his laptop and began digging, searching for any connection between Evelyn and the Orion Group. It didn't take long to find it. Evelyn Grayson had been the director of a nonprofit called Bright Futures, an organization that claimed to provide education and resources to underprivileged children. But according to the documents, Bright Futures was a front, a way for the Orion Group to launder money and recruit vulnerable individuals. Jade felt a surge of anger. How many lives had been destroyed by this organization? How many people had been exploited, all while Grayson and his associates lined their pockets? The meeting with Evelyn. Jade knew he needed to confront Evelyn Grayson. She was the key to unraveling the senator's involvement with the Orion Group, and if anyone knew the truth about Sarah Collins, it was her. He found her address easily enough, a sprawling estate in one of DC's most affluent neighborhoods. The house was a fortress, surrounded by high walls and security cameras. But JD wasn't deterred. He waited until nightfall, then scaled the wall and slipped into the backyard. The house was dark, save for a single light in an upstairs window. JD moved quickly, his heart pounding as he approached the back door. It was unlocked. He stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath his feet. The house was eerily quiet, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and polished wood. JD moved through the shadows, his senses on high alert. He found Evelyn in the study, sitting at a desk with a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up as he entered, her eyes widening in shock. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "J.D. Vance," he said, stepping into the light. "I think you know why I'm here." Evelyn's face paled, and she set the glass down with a shaky hand. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered. "I didn't have a choice," Jade replied. "I need answers. About the Orion Group, about Sarah Collins, and about your husband." Evelyn looked away, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You don't understand," she said. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "Then explain it to me," Jade said, his voice firm. For a long moment, Evelyn was silent. Then she sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Richard, he's not the man you think he is. He's been involved with the Orion Group for years. They gave him power, money, influence, but it came at a cost." "What kind of cost?" JD asked. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "They made him do things, terrible things. And when Sarah Collins threatened to expose them, they made him deal with her." JD felt a surge of anger. "You're saying he killed her?" Evelyn shook her head. "No, but he made her disappear. And he's been trying to cover it up ever since." The revelation. JD sat down across from Evelyn, his mind racing. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because I can't live with it anymore," Evelyn said, her voice breaking. "I spent years pretending everything was fine, but it's not. Richard, he's not the man I married, and I can't keep protecting him." She reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a flash drive, handing it to JD. "This has everything you need to expose him. Bank records, emails, everything. Just be careful. If they find out you have this, they'll kill you." Jade took the flash drive, his hands trembling. "Thank you," he said. Evelyn nodded, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Just promise me one thing. When this is over, make sure the world knows the truth. About Richard, about the Orion Group, and about Sarah." The black SUV idled at the curb, its engine purring softly. Agent Cole sat behind the wheel, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the street lamp. J.D. Vance hesitated, his hand tightening around the flash drive in his pocket. He didn't trust Cole, not after everything he'd learned, but he also knew he didn't have much of a choice. "Get in," Cole repeated, his voice low and urgent. J.D. glanced around the quiet street. There was no one else in sight, but he could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him. He slid into the passenger seat, the door closing with a soft click. The SUV pulled away from the curb, merging into the flow of traffic. Cole drove in silence for several minutes, his eyes fixed on the road. J.D. studied him, trying to gauge his intentions. "What do you want?" J.D. asked finally, breaking the silence. Cole glanced at him, his expression grim. I want to help you, JD, but you're making it very difficult. Help me, JD repeated, his voice rising. You've been following me, threatening me. I've been trying to protect you, Cole interrupted. You have no idea what you're up against. The Orion Group isn't just some shadowy organization. They're everywhere, in the government, in the media, in law enforcement. If they find out you have that flash drive, you're dead. JD felt a chill run down his spine. Then why are you helping me? Cole sighed, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Because I made a promise. To your mother. JD froze. What are you talking about? Cole glanced at him again, his eyes filled with something JD couldn't quite place, regret, maybe, or guilt. Sarah Collins. She was my informant. I was working undercover, trying to bring down the Orion Group. She trusted me, and I failed her. G's mind raced. You knew her? Cole nodded. She was brave, JD braver than anyone I've ever met. She risked everything to expose the Orion Group, and they killed her for it. I couldn't save her, but I promised myself I'd protect you. JD felt a surge of anger. You've been following me this whole time, and you never thought to tell me any of this. I couldn't, Cole said, his voice tight. The less you knew, the safer you were. But now you forced my hand. The SUV pulled into an underground parking garage, the dim lights casting long shadows across the concrete walls. Cole parked the car and turned to face JD. You have the flash drive, he said. That's good. But it's not enough. If you want to bring down the Orion Group, you're going to need more than just evidence. You're going to need a plan. The plan. Cole led JD to a small, windowless room in the corner of the garage. The walls were lined with maps, photographs, and documents, all related to the Orion Group. JD recognized some of the names and faces from the documents he'd found in the safe house. This is everything we've been able to gather, Cole said, gesturing to the walls. But it's not enough to take them down. Not yet. JD frowned. What do you mean? The Orion Group is too powerful, Cole explained. They have too many people in high places. If you go public with what you have, they'll just bury it. You need to hit them where it hurts. Their money. JD felt a flicker of hope. How? Cole pulled out a folder and handed it to JD. Inside was a detailed plan, outlining how to infiltrate the Orion Group's financial network and expose their offshore accounts. This is risky, Cole warned. If they catch you, they'll kill you. But if you succeed, it could bring them down for good. JD studied the plan, his mind racing. It was dangerous, but it was also his best chance. Maybe his only chance, to expose the truth and clear his mother's name. I'll do it, he said finally. Cole nodded, his expression grim. Then we don't have much time. The Orion Group is already onto you. If we're going to move, we need to move now. The infiltration. The plan was simple in theory, but nearly impossible in practice. JD would pose as a financial consultant hired by the Orion Group to help manage their offshore accounts. With Cole's help, he would gain access to their system and download the evidence they needed to expose the organization. But there was one catch. JD would have to do it in person, at the Orion Group's headquarters. The building was a towering skyscraper in the heart of DC, its glass facade reflecting the city lights like a mirror. JD stood outside, his heart pounding as he adjusted his tie and smoothed his jacket. He could feel the weight of the flash drive in his pocket, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Cole had provided him with a fake ID and a cover story, but JD knew it wouldn't be enough to fool the Orion Group. He would have to rely on his wits and a little bit of luck. He stepped into the lobby, the polished marble floors gleaming under the bright lights. A security guard approached him, his expression stern. "Can I help you?" the guard asked. Jade forced a smile. "I'm here for a meeting with Mr. Grayson." The guard studied him for a moment, then nodded. Elevator to the 42nd floor. JD stepped into the elevator, his heart racing as the doors closed behind him. The ride to the 42nd floor felt like an eternity, each second stretching out as his mind raced with possibilities. When the doors finally opened, he stepped out into a sleek, modern office. The walls were lined with screens displaying financial data, and a group of well-dressed men and women sat at desks, their eyes fixed on their computers. At the far end of the room, seated behind a massive desk, was Senator Richard Grayson. The confrontation. Grayson looked up as JD approached, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "I've been expecting you." JD froze, his heart pounding. "You have?" Grayson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, you didn't think we would know, did you? You've been making quite a stir." JD felt a surge of panic, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm here to help," he said, his voice steady. "I have information that could be valuable to you." Grayson leaned back in his chair, studying JD with a cold, calculating gaze. "And what makes you think we need your help?" JD took a deep breath. "Because I know about Sarah Collins, and I know what you did to her." For a moment, Grayson was silent. Then he laughed, a low, chilling sound. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But you're also very, very foolish." He pressed a button on his desk, and the doors behind JD burst open. Two armed guards stepped into the room, their guns trained on JD. "Take him," Grayson said, his voice cold. The room erupted into chaos. The armed agents moved with precision, disarming Grayson's guards and securing the area within seconds. JD Vance stood frozen in the center of the room, his heart pounding as he tried to process what was happening. Agent Cole stepped forward, his gun trained on Grayson. "It's over, Senator," he said, his voice cold and steady. "You're under arrest." Grayson's face twisted in rage. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "The Orion Group is bigger than me. Bigger than all of you. You'll never take us down." Cole didn't flinch. "We'll see about that." He motioned to the agents, who quickly handcuffed Grayson and led him out of the room. Jade watched as the senator was escorted away, his mind racing. It was over, or at least it felt like it was. But Cole's expression was grim as he turned to JD. "We've got him, but this is just the beginning. The Orion Group has tentacles everywhere. Taking down Grayson is a start, but it's going to take a lot more to bring the whole organization to its knees." JD nodded, his hands still trembling. "What do we do now?" Cole handed him a folder. "This is everything we've got on the Orion Group. Names, locations, financial records. It's enough to start an investigation, but it's going to take time. And it's going to be dangerous." JD took the folder, his mind racing. He had the evidence he needed to expose the truth, but he also knew the risks. The Orion Group had already tried to kill him once. They wouldn't hesitate to try again. The aftermath. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Jade worked closely with Cole and a team of federal agents, providing them with the information he gathered and helping to piece together the full scope of the Orion Group's operations. It was a daunting task. The organization's reach was vast, stretching across multiple countries and industries. But with each new piece of evidence, JD felt a growing sense of hope. They were making progress, slowly but surely. Meanwhile, the media was in a frenzy. The arrest of Senator Grayson had sent shockwaves through the political world, and the revelations about the Orion Group were dominating the headlines. JD found himself at the center of it all, his face plastered across newspapers and TV screens. But the attention came at a cost. JD received countless threats, some anonymous, others disturbingly specific. He was forced to move from one safe house to another, always looking over his shoulder, always wondering if the next corner would be his last. The final confrontation. One night, As JD was reviewing documents in a dimly lit safe house, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You think you've won, but the game isn't over." Before he could react, the lights went out. JD froze, his heart pounding in the darkness. He reached for the gun Cole had given him, his hands trembling as he gripped the weapon. The sound of footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. JD held his breath, his eyes straining to see through the blackness. "JD Vance," a voice said, cold and menacing. "You've been a thorn in our side for too long." JD didn't respond. He could feel the presence of the intruder, could sense the danger closing in. "You think you've exposed us," the voice continued. "But you've only scratched the surface. The Orion Group is eternal. And you're just a footnote." Jay tightened his grip on the gun, his mind racing. He knew he was outmatched, but he wasn't going down without a fight. The footsteps grew closer, and JD raised the gun, his finger hovering over the trigger. Then suddenly, the lights flickered back on. JD blinked, his eyes adjusting to the brightness. The room was empty, save for a single envelope on the table in front of him. He approached it cautiously, his gun still raised. The envelope was plain, with no markings or writing. He opened it carefully, his hands trembling as he pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a list of names, dozens of them, all high-ranking officials and powerful individuals. At the top of the list was a name that made JD's blood run cold: Evelyn Grayson. The revelation. JD stared at the list, his mind racing. Evelyn Grayson had been working with the Orion Group all along. Her confession, her tears, it had all been an act. She had played him, using him to take down her husband, while she continued to pull the strings from the shadows. He felt a surge of anger, but also a strange sense of clarity. The Orion Group wasn't just an organization. It was an idea, a network of power and corruption that would always find a way to survive. But that didn't mean he was going to stop fighting. The lesson. JD spent the next few weeks working tirelessly to expose the truth. He published the list of names, along with the evidence he gathered, in a series of explosive articles that rocked the nation. The fight was immediate. Dozens of high-profile individuals were arrested, and the Orion Group's operations were dealt a crippling blow. But JD knew the fight wasn't over. The organization would regroup, rebuild, and come back stronger than ever. And he would be ready. As he stood on the steps of the Capitol, addressing a crowd of reporters and onlookers, JD felt a sense of purpose he'd never known before. "This isn't the end," he said, his voice steady and strong. "The fight against corruption, against greed, against injustice, it's never over. But as long as there are people willing to stand up and speak out, there's hope. And that's what we have to hold on to." The crowd erupted into applause, but JD barely heard it. His mind was already racing ahead, planning his next move. Because he knew one thing for certain: the truth was worth fighting for.